The story of such a grand house must always start at the beginning, and in this case, the beginning involved a battle between the English and the French. In August of 1346, a young knight called Thomas Daniers fought in the Battle of Crecy. It was an unexpected victory for the English, who were hugely outnumbered, and it would come to shape the fortune of Thomas's descendants and pass into Lyme legend. As a reward for Thomas's valiant efforts in saving his son, the Black Prince, King Edward III awarded him an annuity of £40 a year, which was later exchanged for a piece of land by Thomas's granddaughter Margaret and her husband Piers. The estate they chose was Lyme. Piersley was knighted by King Richard II in 1397, but his elevation was short-lived. He was executed in 1399 when Henry Bolingbroke seized the English throne and became Henry IV. For the next 300 years, the Leghs of Lyme found their stories twisting and turning throughout the history of England itself. Margaret and Piers' son was wounded at the Battle of Agincourt, and Piers V fought at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. Following the death of his wife Ellen, he turned to the family's Catholic religion and was ordained as a priest in 1512. It was Piers who purchased the Lyme Missal. Printed by William Caxton in 1487, this is the most important book in the National Trust's collection. The Lyme Missal is the only surviving and largely intact book of its kind. There had been a house on the site at Lyme since the late 1400s, but this was demolished when Piers Leigh VII built the bones of the house we see today in the middle of the 16th century. Originally, the house was L-shaped and added to bit by bit over the next 200 years. From the outside, not much remains of the Tudor manor house apart from the frontispiece that dominates the north approach, but inside tells a different story. Lyme is like any house that has been owned by the same family for a long time, each generation adding something new. Small changes were made, but it wasn't until Peter Leigh XII employed Giacomo Leone in the early 1700s that the house came to resemble a great Palladian mansion. Leone added the south front and established the iconic view of Lyme that we see today. Peter's own life was fairly tumultuous, and it isn't a surprise that he spent his later years occupied in home renovation. Peter had been heavily involved with a group of local landowners who called themselves the Cheshire Gentlemen, and they wanted to see King James II restored as the rightful English monarch. Meetings took place at Lyme in the Stag Parlour, but this behaviour was highly treasonous, and Peter was arrested twice and imprisoned in the Tower of London. The house fell into disrepair after being inherited by a sequence of uninterested heirs. The most infamous of these was Colonel Thomas Peter Leigh, who fathered 7 children, all of whom were illegitimate and all of whom had different mothers. He died young, and after legal wrangling and an Act of Parliament, his young son, also called Thomas, inherited Lyme and the Leigh family estates. A doctor of civil law, an MP and a shrewd businessman, Thomas Leigh had travelled to the Near East, bringing back artefacts from Greece. He was the engineer of the golden age of the estate, and his canny investments and foresight ensured the family's prosperity well into the next century. Thomas also put his stamp on the house, employing fashionable architect Lewis Wyatt to turn the mismatch of rooms into a suitably splendid Regency residence. He married Ellen Turner in 1828, the wealthy heiress of neighbouring Shrigley Hall, and they had one daughter. After his death in 1857, Lyme passed to his nephew William Legh, who was a Member of Parliament and elevated to the peerage as Baron Newton for political services in 1892. His son, the second Baron Newton, served as Paymaster General during the First World War and was a member of the Privy Council. But it is the books of his wife Evelyn and his daughter Phyllis that reveal more about Lyme. Lady Newton's The House of Lyme is a history of the estate and family, whereas Treasure on Earth gives an intimate account of a family Christmas at Lyme at the turn of the 20th century. After the Second World War, the family's prime source of income, coal, was requisitioned by the government. And it was in 1946 that Richard Legh began talks to hand over the house and the surrounding parklands to the National Trust. The stories of this magnificent house and its residents are closely knitted to the history of England itself. Lyme has been a hunting lodge, a place of business, a magistrate's court, a space to entertain, and the place of plotting. But for the Legh family and the army of servants who looked after them, Lyme was always home.